Hey guys, this is Ginger Bandine. For today's Data Fun Friday, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So instead of jumping right to looking at a query or a visualization, I wanted to play around with talking you through the thought process that goes on when I'm trying to start a data project. And there was a great example of this in this week. I watched a webinar from Christy Winter from Qualifax. She did this great webinar called Navigating the Path to Value-Based Care, and it was all about how to, the process of getting a good data system in place. So you decided you want to start measuring something. How do you decide what you want to measure? How do you help change your agency's culture to maximize the possibility of success with that venture? How do you monitor that data? Just the whole process. It was a great webinar. You can probably still see a replay of it. So if you'd like more information, send me an email or put a comment in the YouTube channel and I will get that information for you. So Christy shared an idea about one example of some data that an agency could capture to move toward more data-driven decision-making. And she was talking about PHQ-9 scores. So here's a little clip I just pulled right out of her slides because I saw it and I was like, oh, I want to think more about that. So this whole sheet of information is sort of some of the thoughts I came up with when I thought about, well, how would we actually do what Christy was talking about? So Christy's slide said she wanted that an agency could decide to measure PHQ-9 scores, look at number of visits, and look at the population of people whose initial PHQ-9 score was about 5. And then the example she used as a question you would be able to answer with that data was, are people's PHQ-9 scores improving over time with treatment? But also, is there a point at which the improvements are declining or leveling off? And is there something we could do to measure that and see if in certain programs, after 5 sessions, a person's PHQ-9 scores are no longer improving, and so maybe we need to shift the focus of treatment, or maybe there's some utilization management to do there. So it was a really interesting way to think about data. And so I started thinking about, okay, well, what would I need to do to actually make a report about that data? So here's just my thought process that I wanted to share with you guys, because I think often that is the first step in a data project. So here's the initial data idea, which was, I'm just repeating what Christy has in her slide, the PHQ-9 scores, the number of visits, and the population of people whose initial PHQ-9 score was about 5. And here are the questions that we're interested in answering. Are PHQ-9 scores overall improving with treatment? Or is there a certain number of visits where improvements in scores are leveling off? So here's all the data we would need to capture that, right? We would need a data set that includes clients with at least 2 PHQ-9 scores, because if we're really just interested in improvements, there isn't really much point in including people who've only had 1 score. And we want to look at people whose first score was 5 or more. So for every client in that data set, we're going to want to know the score, their initial score, and the date of that score. And then for every PHQ-9 score after that initial score, we're going to want to know how many visits had the person, or how many services had the person received as of the date of that PHQ-9. And then we're going to also want to know what was the difference in scores from that score that we're talking about for each line, for each piece of data, back to the previous score. What was the difference in score? What was the difference in date? And what was the difference in the number of visits? Because we're probably not doing a PHQ-9 score at every visit. So it'd be kind of interesting to know how many visits had occurred in between. And then we want to maybe do the same thing going all the way back to the original PHQ-9 score, because maybe there's data that's important there related to the change in score overall. Maybe it's not the change from one time to the next, but it's the change from the beginning. So we could do the same thing, the difference in score, days, and visits, all the way back to the original PHQ-9. And then thinking about how we're going to aggregate and organize that information, we're going to want to figure out maybe the average of the change in scores across clients, and then separate it out by the number of visits that had been provided, or the number of services that had been provided to clients as of the day of that PHQ-9. So you do it that way. Maybe you'd also want to do some aggregating where you average that by the number of days active in a program. So because it would kind of skew your data if you think about it. Like if some programs are only doing a PHQ-9 score every year, and so they are showing like a huge improvement, and the person has received 300 services in that year. That's a huge exaggeration, but let's just say that would be different than a score that changed drastically from 2 weeks ago and a person had received fewer services. So days between might be important and might be something to include. So that's the initial part of thinking about that data. But then I always think too about what are some other things we're going to want to know once we see those averages. Sometimes you know it beforehand, and sometimes you don't realize it until you're getting in there. But some other information that might be interesting to look at would be people who never received a second PHQ-9 score. I've talked about this before, but I think that is a huge piece of data that we're not using effectively in many of our agencies, because especially if someone has a really high initial PHQ-9 score and they drop out of treatment, or they know something happens and their treatment's disrupted between that score and they never get another score. I think particularly those that might be some really important data to use to help improve our services, particularly around access. So anyway, that's a piece of information we might also want to think about tracking. So then in that case, you could have everybody in your data set, but you could put a flag on the person if they had 2 or more scores, and only include that set of data for certain projects, but include all the data for other projects. And then for every client in the data set, you might want to also look at some social determinants of health, like housing status, were multiple providers involved in the person's treatment, maybe what program or programs they were active on, and the date of their initial PHQ-9, maybe as of their ongoing PHQ-9 scores, the primary diagnosis, the provider, all those kinds of details. And again, you could do that for both the initial PHQ-9 score and then for each of the ongoing PHQ-9 scores. So that's just a little summary of how I would think about putting together an actual report to address this question, this set of data that Christy talked about in her webinar. And I kind of go through a similar process for every data project. So I thought for today's Data Fun Friday, we might talk about that instead of just jumping right into the data. So maybe next week I'll take some of this and put it into a query and a visualization, and we'll do that side of things. But I thought you guys might find this helpful too. Okay guys, that's this week's Data Fun Friday. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to know more about the things that I do, you can check out my website, which is missiondrivendata.com. And you can also email me at ginger@missiondrivendata.com. And I will talk to you guys again next week. All right, have a great weekend. Bye.